Good afternoon. I hope that you can hear me, and thank you, Frank. It is a great pleasure to be back here. I was here, I think, 10 years ago, and was anybody in the audience then? No, just you. Okay. Well, it's completely changed, but you won't know that, of course. It's evolved. It has evolved. I've taken where I was 10 years ago and added to it. Last term time I talked, we were looking at disappearing London. I'm afraid to say that it is still the case that we are looking at the number of gardens, the amount of space devoted to gardens in London, particularly in London, but elsewhere, is diminishing. So, I'm going to leave time at the end for questions, 5 to 10 minutes for questions. And there'll be a handout at the end, as many of you probably know. I'm going to start with not my favourite author, but one of my favourite books. This is A. Gill, the writer and restaurant critic, who says nothing man-made, that's his language, is as beautiful as a garden. He says that England's great gardens aren't a recreation of Eden. They're just so much as what Eden would have grown to look like if only God had the foresight to exempt the English from expulsion. The book is called, I think The Angry Island, Hunting the English, and it tells in many chapters why the English are so angry about everything. And I commend the book to you, particularly the chapter on gardens and gardening. So we do seem to have a particular love of gardening, probably more than almost any other country in the world. There are, however, some naysayers. Here's someone writing just 16, 17 years ago, who asked what is the real conservation value of English suburban gardens, really? They're neat little lawns, they're nut feeders and nest boxes. He says blue tits, which have no real conservation value. We'll come back to blue tits later on in the talk. They're busy devouring his expensive imported peanuts, whose production occupies prime agricultural land in a poor country. Pure entertainment and a sentimental luxury. Well, I think that's a bit extreme. 100 grams of peanuts is about £1.20, which doesn't sound particularly expensive. The major peanut exporters of the world are China, India, Nigeria, the US. There don't seem to be many poor countries amongst that lot, really. Potentially, anyway. I think it's a bit unfair, but I think the point is made is that sometimes we get sucked into wildlife and wildlife garden appreciation, and often don't step back enough and think about what we're doing or why we're doing it. And while I'm a prime advocate of wildlife gardening, I want us to take a bit more of a critical look to try and think of what really works, what evidence we have that some things work better than others, and how we decide what to do. And why? Why am I so convinced? Well, we have lost in the past 50, since the war really, we've lost about 98% of our wildflower meadows, 50% of our ancient woodlands, and so on, and so on. So our 23 million gardens in the UK are fundamentally important and sustain a huge amount of wildlife. And the total acreage, hectareage really, 500,000 hectares, is increasingly important as more and more of the green space gets cut back. Our gardens become increasingly safe havens for nature and wildlife. Although we are equally good at keeping and killing things in our gardens to make them better, we are also very good. We have a sort of slightly curious relationship. We like some things, but we don't like others. It's interesting, in Canada, some parts of Canada, some people like chipmunks, and they attract chipmunks into their gardens by putting sunflower seeds out. Other people hate chipmunks, and they use the same seeds and put them into pails of water so that chipmunks go for the sunflower seeds and fall in and drown. So this sort of curious love-hate relationship with some of the species that populate our gardens, not just in this country, but across the world. Since I did the talk 10 years ago, this rather impressive report came out, written by Chloe Smith on behalf of the London Wildlife Trust, Green Space Information for Greater London, abbreviated to GIGGLE. and the Greater London Association Authority. And it's a fascinating piece of work, freely available on the web, and it gives you sort of the anatomy of London's gardens and highlights some of the what's been happening over the last 8 to 10 years. And it's full of interesting facts and figures. This is not a map. It's a key. It's not all of West London is hard surfaces. It's just a pie chart, a representation to show you, if you look at the entire area of gardens in the Greater London area. And I think you can, I think you can see the Isle of Dogs there, and then going west, you can see right in the centre of the pie chart, you can see the Waterloo Loop to give you a sort of sense of where we are. So, if you look at gardens across London, about a third of them are hard surfaces for people's car space and so on. Just under a third, about 29%, is lawns, and then we have about a fifth is trees, 10% is shrubs, and so on. So we've got an interesting mix of usage of gardens. That hard surface has increased as the years have gone by, and is a real problem, because the more hard surfaces there are, the more water runoff there is into our sewers, the more likely areas are to flood. If there's one thing you might want to change about your garden, it's not necessarily planting new species or putting out feeders, whatever. It's probably reducing the amount of hard surface that you have in your garden. It's now, since the mid-2000s, you have to get planning permission in order to put a hard surface in your front garden. You can do, to some extent, more what you please in the back garden, but it's too little too late, I'm afraid. Too many London gardens front gardens have got hard surfaces, and that's exacerbating the problem of rainfall runoff. If you look at the typical gardens across London, the back garden is by far the large, about 2/3 of the garden in any of a typical London house is back garden. Front garden is about 12%, and then side gardens or communal gardens in estates probably occupies about 25% of the garden space across London. So our back gardens tend to be bigger than our front gardens, but it's the front gardens that we pave over for obvious reasons in some cases. So about 24% of Greater London, about just under a quarter of Greater London, is private, domestic, which gives you a sense of just how important London's gardens are to London's wildlife and to the experience of nature that we have in London. Of that garden land, 57% is lawns, tree canopy and vegetation, and therefore, if you do the sums, about 14% of Greater London is lawn, green space and tree cover, which is substantial. And across London, we said about 23 million gardens across the UK, there are about 4 million individual gardens in the London area. That gives you a sense of how challenging it is for charities that want to impact on what goes on in gardens. If you are a London-based charity like the London Wildlife Trust, you want to engage people in changing their behaviours, you're trying to influence 5 million different garden owners. The London Wildlife Trust has a membership of about 10,000 people. You can see the scale of the problem that London's charities face. And there are over 2.5 million garden trees in London. Okay, we talked about 2/3 being hard surface. The back garden, 33% of back garden is normally lawn, 22% hard cover, and a lot more space of trees. So it works out about 1 tree per garden in the London area. Here we are. Back gardens have about 1.9 million trees, front gardens 0.4, other gardens, communal gardens 0.3. So on average you've got about 1 tree per back garden, and every other garden, and 1 tree in every 5 front gardens. So that's about 4% of London is covered by trees. And that can be overhang from trees outside or from next door, as well as trees inside your own back gardens. There's a discrepancy across the London counties. As you look in the outer London areas, like Bromley, Barnet, have the largest gardens. Not surprisingly, the areas around here, areas such as Hackney, City of Westminster, have smaller gardens. And it's generally the case that London's gardens are smaller than those in the rest of the country. If we look close by, you can see this is the Holborn going across the bottom. We are just to the south of Holborn. If you look around the area, there aren't many gardens. There are quite small. What there are natural open spaces and unnatural open spaces. Mostly unnatural. Lincoln's Inn Fields we've got. Some of the other sort of Inns of Court. But really, it's amazing that any wildlife survives at all in a built-up area like this. Just to the north of at the top of the map is the Bourne Estate. So the Bourne Estate, built around just over 110 years ago, for social housing, and you can see more like a fortress to keep wildlife out than to attract wildlife in. There is, of course, some trees. There are lots of trees in the area to sort of keep a bit of privacy, but of course they are London plane trees, which have almost no wildlife value whatsoever. Like anything, any species named London, it is not an indigenous London species. The London plane is probably a mixture of the Oriental plane and the American sycamore, the US sycamore. Probably came over probably started growing in the 1700s. It's very good, it's great, it lasts several hundred years. It can cope with pollution because that bark that you see, that rather elegant bark that you see falling off, is the way it deals with pollution. The pollution gets stuck on the bark falls off, and the tree survives. The only species that really seems to enjoy living with the London plane is the grey squirrel, which is, of course, another contentious species. Grey squirrels seem to like the seeds of the London plane. So one non-indigenous species feeding on another. But the vast majority, almost half the trees in London are London plane trees, and they contribute almost nothing to London's biodiversity. And London's biodiversity is quite fragile. This is a map of Greater London showing the pink areas, and many of them are areas of substantial deficiency in terms of nature. So you can see that, again, in central London, but in large parts of the councils of London, there are areas of great deficiency. And that's why gardens are hugely important, because they allow species to survive in areas where there aren't natural parks or open spaces. The thing that keeps nature going in those areas is people's gardens. And we're quite good as a city at allocating and protecting areas, borough, local nature conservation areas. So we've done quite a good job. The local authorities have done quite a good job at trying to protect what's there, but at the same time they have to balance the demand of developers and development, and that's making the amount of green space that we have smaller. So that's a very complex picture, and it's one which shows you why London's 4 or 5 million gardens are so important, because without them, London's biodiversity would be nowhere near as strong as it is now. So the report, the Garden City report, shows that over the last 10 years, the gardens in London have continued to change quite substantially. We are losing substantial amounts of lawns and garden trees. Most of those, most of the shrinkage isn't due to development. It's due to gardeners, individual homeowners making changes to their own gardens rather than to developers making massive changes. Because generally development happens on land which is already developed. So that you may not, this may be slightly surprising, so most of the changes, most of the cutback in size of green space in London is caused by individual gardeners making changes to their gardens rather than to development. And collectively, when you put all these developments together, the implications for London's wildlife are quite severe, which makes it even more important that those of us who do wildlife garden actually continue to make efforts and take wise action. So compared with 1998 and 1999, we've lost about 12% of our vegetated land, that tree cover, the grassland is 12%. That's about the size of 2.5 Hyde Parks every year. So if you can imagine 2.5 Hyde Parks every year, we're losing that amount of green space in our gardens and smaller open spaces. And that's primarily due to people putting hard spaces down for their cars. We've lost 2,500 hectares. And also because people have started putting extra things in their garden. Every time someone puts a shed or an extension to their house in the garden, we lose some green space in almost every case. If you add that together over the last 10 years or so, we've lost about 1,000 hectares simply because people are putting things in their back garden. And the amount of lawn space has gone down by 16%. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Lawns aren't necessarily wonderful for wildlife, but it does give you a sense of the scale of changes in London's garden, even in the last since 1980, 1998, 1999. In terms of the changes due to development, we've quite small numbers, 311 housing developments per year occurring on private garden land. 500 gardens were lost to development. We don't really know how many gardens were put back every time. We know when gardens are lost, but we don't often know how often gardens are put back into those spaces. So it could be the amount of land lost to development is even smaller than we think it is. That's not to say development isn't a threat to London's wildlife. It is, but it's not nearly the bigger threat compared with individual gardens and their owners. London is a biodiverse city. Ecology as a science has been around for a long time, but urban ecology hasn't been around for that long. The London Wildlife Trust was the last wildlife trust to be set up in England, simply because people didn't think there was any wildlife really in London. In some ways, people argue London is the most biodiverse place in England. It has more habitats, more variety of habitats, probably more variety of species than any other part of England. So in some ways, London's wildlife is richer than any other part of the UK, although you probably wouldn't realise it, probably wouldn't think it at first thought. Here's some examples. Mistletoe shows the rarity of mistletoe. Mistletoe, it turns out, is a key species ecologically. It's a parasite. It was often cut back from trees because it was it looked ugly and people thought it was damaging the trees. It turns out it's a keystone species, which means that if mistletoe survives, lots of other species survive as well. So actually what we should be doing is to encourage mistletoe, and the London Biodiversity Partnerships, which is a collection of charities and local government, are trying to bring back mistletoe into greater parts of London. But you can see from that map provided by Giggle just how rare mistletoe is in London. It is also the case with all of these maps that these maps are not just a map of the species, they're often a map of the people who go and look for them. So there are many parts of London where there are far more ecologists out there looking than others. So it may well be that there are lots of mistletoe in parts of London where urban ecologists don't go so frequently. So the maps don't always tell you the story of a particular species. One of the other protected species, one of the other species that people are trying to put back is water voles, working with developers to try and get more water voles to populate London. And it's hugely successful. Developers are now realising that if you can sell houses as having water voles and lots of other wildlife and invertebrates around, the value of the property is seen to be more to increase because people like to live in an environmentally friendly place. So developers are now seeing it's to their advantage to have a wildlife-friendly approach to their developments. Black redstart, one of those species that is found more in London than almost anywhere else. So again, London has it's mainly Deptford, that east central part of London is a great site for black redstarts. One of those species that without London would probably almost disappear from the British flora and fauna. Tends to survive on brownfield sites, which were created after the bombing in the Second World War. That's why they're all clustered around the east end of London. Stag beetles. A lot of people are not that fond of stag beetles. You can see a huge predominance of stag beetles in the south of London compared with the north. There's an inverse correlation between taxes and stag beetles, someone pointed out. I think it's just random. It's just random sense. No one's really sure why it is the case that stag beetles tend to be found more in the south. Maybe there's more forest areas around there. It may be the kind of soil, the kind of geology. But that's quite an interesting map, and that isn't a function of the people going to look for them. It is generally a huge shift north-south between species of between occurrence of stag beetles. Black butterfly records seem to be the yellow areas, the areas where a great predominance of butterflies found by the London Natural History Society. It's the northwest west areas where, but almost all areas of London have substantial numbers of butterflies found in them, although their numbers vary quite considerably year by year. So London is a very biodiverse city. It is one of the great cities in the world for finding diversity, for finding a whole range of species, and in some ways it is more valuable as a habitat than many parts of the countryside. And we forget that at our peril. So what is it that we can do? What are we able to do? And what have we been doing, and why should we do it? So there's no shortage of, if you look on the web, of ideas, suggestions for improvements you can make. Some of them are quite inspiring, some of them are soul-destroying, because you realise you could never in 1,000 years do anything as amazing as people are doing. No shortage of advice. This is advice from the wildlife trusts about what you can do to make a space for nature in your garden. They say go wild in your garden, large or small. Your garden can be a mosaic, and this is true. It doesn't matter how large your garden is, it can still have an impact on increasing biodiversity. Martin Cox points out, from the RHS Wildlife Garden, points out, it used to be the case that people thought a wildlife garden was one that was just left to run wild. And I was quite happy with this. I was quite happy with the idea that if I was letting my garden run wild, I was doing a good thing. But sadly, that's not the case. It's the case that if you manage your garden more effectively, it can have far more of an impact than just letting things run wild. Every inch of space counts, he says. Catalogues are full of things that are quite shishy. And he's true. There's a lot of money to be made out of encouraging us to do things for wildlife. And we shall examine whether some of those are a waste of money or not later on. There's a greater biodiversity, somebody found in 2003, in a well-managed wildlife garden, which has a wide variety of plants than one which has been left to become tangled undergrowth. So I'm afraid the bad news is, for those of us who are lazy gardeners, that actually a more active gardening in a more managed space is better for biodiversity than just letting things run wild. RSPB, with a particular bird focus, have their list of what to do. So this is a list from them. Choosing the right flowers to help birds, mixture of trees and shrubs. Water is certainly a key. It's interesting, all these different organisations have their different lists of what you can do, depending on their perspective. They never really say which one is more effective than others. They just give you a list and assume that you just pick from as to what you think you can do. Actually, that's not the case. There are some things that we know are more effective, and we'll look at those a bit later on. But it is the case that, we'll see. Adding water to a garden is probably one of the most effective things that you can do if you want to sort of increase the biodiversity of some species. This mixture of trees and shrubs seems to work, and growing particular kinds of flowers, some flowers, not others. And here we are, how to care for hedgehogs in your garden. Hedgehogs are, how many people have seen a hedgehog in their garden? Okay, so less than 10%. So they are nocturnal, so if you see one during the day, it's probably not a good sign. It probably means there's something not particularly well with it. But they are more common than maybe people realise, because they are frequently come out at night. So here's some advice from a company called the Wildlife Gardener, how to care for them. And it does, this is where they're found in London. This is where the evidence suggests they are. So the darker the blue, the more counts there have been of hedgehogs. So they are by no means common across the whole of London, but by no means kept clustering in a particular area, apart from maybe the southeast. They are seen across London, and I think there are ways to encourage hedgehogs. Having a little small hole in the fence to allow hedgehogs to go through seems to be a way, because hedgehogs do roam, not as much as cats, but hedgehogs do roam quite a lot, and that's a way of encouraging them to go from garden to garden to garden. what to feed hedgehogs. This is the classic advice about don't feed hedgehogs milk or bread. It gives them diarrhea. And yet, for some reason, we have this belief that everyone should leave bread and milk for hedgehogs. It's actually like cat food or dog food and bacon rind. But there's no shortage of advice. There's no shortage of things to do. Here's Jenny Steele's wildlife gardening. Her list is the start. Just relax. It's okay. You don't have to do everything. You can just take your time. Just do things. Garden organically is probably extremely good advice. Don't use pesticides because those are the things that have a deleterious impact on wildlife. Wildflowers, nectar border again, trees, hedges. So there's recurrent themes in this advice. Trees, hedges, diversity, managing, making a meadow if you have space, ponds, water, feeding birds, and be tolerant. So you pull all these things together, I think, you get a good sense of what it is that people seem to be able to give you as advice. But again, no real sense of what works better than anything else. Here we are, the Royal Horticultural Society. I'm on their education committee. Has some extremely interesting projects. Has a nice database if you want to attract particular kind of invertebrates. And the database will tell you which plants are better than others at attracting the kind of insects into your garden that you want to see. So again, all this is free, all this is on the web, it's all easily available. And there's a slight bias. All these websites have their own particular bias depending on the organisation involved. But nevertheless, they offer you high quality, often scientifically based advice. As the RHS and the Wildlife Trust say, anyone with a garden can make a difference, and that's the key message. Anyone, everyone can make some difference. It doesn't mean turn into wildness. Take simple steps you can do. And between us, between these 4.8 million wildlife gardens in London, we can make a huge difference. What tends to be the case is that people are affected by their neighbours. So if your neighbour starts wildlife gardening, it is more likely that you will. And conversely, if you try to make some steps to improve the wildlife in your garden, your neighbours will follow suit. We're very collectivist in this way. It tends to be in cities, people tend to follow what their next door neighbours are doing in terms of garden innovation. So if you start, you may think you're not doing much, but it may well be that your neighbours follow on and get converted to be wildlife gardeners if they're not already. So I thought I'd put this to test. It says anyone can do this. So this is my garden in Bristol. You can't see it because it's on top of that Italian restaurant there. It's the patio. When I moved in 14 months ago, it looked like that, which I, years ago, would have thought is a perfect wildlife garden. It has unkempt, moss. What more could you want if you were a species? Yeah, it's just for trees and the local sycamores. Again, not the greatest species for biodiversity. Some of those plants plastic, but again, this is what I inherited, and I thought, well, I am not a good gardener. I may be one of the worst gardeners in the room, but I can do something about it. And so I took the most logical step, which is to get somebody in to do it, who knows better than me. So this is what it looks like now. The only credit I can claim is that it's I paid for it, but it is designed with wildlife in mind. Bristol was Green Capital 2015, which meant that the whole city was trying to do things to promote environmental awareness and environmental change. So what he did really was to put up some plants which attract invertebrates and butterflies, to use some of the existing planters, to put new planters in, to grow grasses, to grow things which climb, to try and create an environment where it was astonishing what a difference it made in a few weeks, particularly in the number of spiders. It seemed the first thing that colonised the garden was spiders of a range of sizes and colours, which indicates that they think there's other invertebrates there to catch. And it's what was fascinating over the period of 10 to 12 months, just watching it's a bit of a mess now, I have to say. But that's because it's winter. But it's interesting to see how quickly a small amount of change can make a difference on what comes through your garden. And that's the sign. What we're trying to do is to grow a honeysuckle that will grow along the railings to try and soften the outlook. I find it fascinating to watch somebody else do this. And in a way quite relaxing. But if you can find time to do it yourself, I think it's even more satisfying. But I have to say, this is quite satisfying. Anyone from the close by, it's the Barbican. The Barbican just goes to show what you can do with a limited balcony space. Barbican won London in Bloom in 2007, 2008. There's a concerted effort. You see what I mean about if some of your neighbours start doing something, more of your neighbours will catch on and carry on. So communally, one person making an effort can mean that several other people make efforts and you grow and grow and grow. And I think that's the sort of another message coming out of what we know about wildlife gardening is you are not alone by any means. This is something I'm planning next. It's these wildlife hotels, bug hotels. I think these seem to be extraordinarily successful, potentially at least, although it's interesting, you've got a whole range of different, these are pallets, wooden pallets with things stuck in them, twigs, straws to try and attract solitary wasps to come and live in pine cones and so on. I think this is something which is every garden should consider having because they have such diversity of habitats. I only sort of started seeing them about 10 years ago, I think, maybe. They've taken off since then. Some are huge towers, some are much squatter, but I think they offer a variety of habitats and they're pretty easy. It's quite a nice use of that sort of bric-a-brac that you find lying around gardens. So, what works? Here's a study by some scientists about 10 years ago. They looked at 5 different innovations. Nest sites, and you saw some there. There's little straws and bamboo shoots for solitary bees and wasps to live in. Some artificial nest sites, little pots for bumblebees to live in. Small ponds, plastic trays with because they chose some gardens and they got people to put large plastic trays of water in rather than to put in huge ponds just to see what worked. Dead wood, birch trees, piles of birch trees, twigs to try and see if they that would rot and bring in beetles and things that liked rotting organisms. Patches of nettles, which everyone says will bring in butterfly larvae. So which of those things worked? Which of those things were more effective over 3 years? Because they set them up in gardens for 3 years to see what happened. What worked? I'll tell you near the end. But the broad conclusion, while some methods increase biodiversity of garden environments, others have a very low probability of success over the time scale that you or I might be interested. We want to see things in 1, 2 or 3 years. We're not really interested in 10 to 20 years. So really, if you're choosing things to do which have a big difference quickly, you have to be quite selective about what it is that we do. You can, if you wish, spend a lot of money and create a habitat for frogs. I think it's probably not an effective use of your money, given that there are lots of other things you can spend it on. You can, if you wish, have a hedgehog, hoggitat. There's plenty of habitats in London's gardens for hedgehogs and frogs that we don't really need you to pay out a lot of money, I don't think, to have artificial ones like this. But the option is there. And if you wish, if you think of other countries, they don't have the same sort of animals. We have here someone from the US saying, give opossums a break. Try and get more opossums to come into your garden. We forget actually what a narrow range of wildlife we have in our garden. My colleagues in the States have deer coming to their garden, which of course destroy everything, so they try and keep them out. And some of my colleagues in Canada have bears coming to their garden. So we forget sometimes that we're working with quite a narrow range of species, but it's interesting to see the sort of problems and the strategies that people are using across the world. The worst comes to the worst, and you just can't attract anything in. Then here's a solution from Chelsea Flower Show a couple of years ago. I just can't imagine thinking that's just what I want for my garden. I really can't. I'm thinking, I know it's nice to see natural things, but in the same pose, day after day after day. This, I think, is more appealing. Wicker badgers. Now, I could go for wicker badgers. There aren't many badger sets in London, but there are some. I wish I was lucky enough to live near one, really. But that's a nice thing to have, I guess. And again, that was for sale at Chelsea some years ago. Even Chelsea's interesting because it shows you the extremes of garden design. I know, the more you look at this, the more you see in it. You've got sunken, in the water you have sunken trays with cacti growing in them, mirrored so you can see them from a distance. Even a garden like this has some wildlife potential. The large area of water space over a period of time would grow and become a thriving pond. But of course, all these things only last a couple of weeks and then taken away somewhere else. This is a more sustainable garden. This is a London Wildlife Trust sponsored garden at Hampton Court Flower Show some years ago, almost 6 or 7 years ago. And you can see how people have used things that you'd normally throw away, bicycle tyres, aluminium poles. On the bottom left, you've got the washing machine drums, which are used sort of little small ponds. And down the bottom right, you've got, anyone recognise? A satellite dish? Turned into a bird feeder, and you put water in it and birds will come along and feed. So there is no limit to our creativity, I think, no limit to the things that we can use to improve our gardens, things that somebody might throw away, we can use ourselves to create a habitat for a whole range of different species. There's beautiful ceramics as well, add immense pleasure to the garden. And again, at the back, you can see these large-scale bird hotels, which are, that's an extreme variety. But again, these seem to be a way of increasing biodiversity in urban gardens. So some caveats, perhaps. So bird feeders, you might think, is a great way of getting birds to come in. It does increase the biodiversity, it does increase the number of finches. There is some evidence that particular kind of feeders spread disease because birds have got the disease will come leave some evidence of their disease, or the birds will come along. So there is some evidence that bird feeders can actually increase trichomoniasis in greenfinches and chaffinches. I don't think that's a reason to stop having bird feeders, but it does mean that you're not always going to increase biodiversity. You might also cause some problems. Here's another study where they looked at bird feeders and they looked at the beetles under the bird feeders and found that in the gardens which had bird feeders, there were fewer insects, fewer beetles below the bird feeders than in gardens and on average in other gardens. So you may well be attracting birds in. You may well be not only just feeding them, but getting rid of some of the diversity of the beetle life in the rest of the garden. So again, getting birds in is good, but it has an impact on the other invertebrates that live in those in your garden. So something to be aware of. So I think here's an interesting study. Get off my lawn. Urban song sparrows. This is in the US. We have song sparrows rather than our house sparrows. What this study showed was that urban sparrows are more aggressive than rural sparrows. And that may be mirrored. If you walk around London, you may see that people are more aggressive in cities than they are in the countryside. That really may be part of the phenomenon. It may well be that if you are having to compete and to survive in a very stressful environment, to survive, you have to be more competitive. And in fact, feeding the birds, the gardens where people fed the birds were more aggressive than the gardens where people didn't feed the birds. So it seems to be increasing bird feeding meant that there was more likely that more birds would come in to try and get all the food that you're putting out, and that increased the fighting between the birds. So if you think that your birds in your garden are fighting, are very aggressive, and that putting food out for them may make them happy, may make them more content, it's the other way around. The more food you put out, the more aggressive your birds may become. That's an experiment worth carrying out, I think, if you are so inclined. But an interesting study in itself. So cats. Cats are interesting. Cats and wildlife gardens, do they go together? So there has been a study by the Mammal Society on how many birds and other species are killed by cats. It's a topic which is still open for debate. Back in 1954, Maxwell Knight was saying, even if cats had bells on them as big as half crowns and they dangled on the edge of 2-inch chains, they'd still be a pest. It's not only on account of their killing propensities, it's the actual presence which is disturbing in itself, even if they only kill one bird a year. Well, Generally, cats do kill birds, kill about one every 2 weeks, but we'll look at that. The Mammal Society survey, which looked at about several hundred, maybe 1,000 gardens, and then scaled up to the UK, found that the 9 million cats, which are the domestic cats, and there's about 500,000 feral cats, which no one seems to own, they catch up to 55 million birds a year. Okay, so is that a big? Well, there's 168 million nesting birds in the UK at the moment, probably, so 55 million is quite a substantial chunk. The most frequently birds are house sparrows, which are increasingly rare, blue tits, which someone earlier on said aren't worth feeding peanuts to, blackbirds and starlings. So is that a problem? Should we be doing something about it? The RSPB, who you'd think would take quite a strict line on it, says that, I'll just look at this bit first. The way they sort of did the survey is by, cats are very good at bringing things back home, so the way they sort of counted the number of birds was by the adults, the owners, keeping a record of how many birds were brought back. Why do cats bring birds back to the house? Well, it seems that when cats, older cats are training their smaller cats, young cats, how to feed, they bring food back. So the cats get a habit of bringing food back to a particular place. So that's why cats seem to bring food back home. Cats in gardens where cats are kept in at night, there are fewer instances of birds being caught, so keeping a cat in at night seems to have an impact. Cats who've got some sort of sound device on them seems to work. But the RSPB says there's no scientific evidence that predation by cats is having any impact on bird populations. Many millions of birds die naturally every year. This is true. But I have to say that if we didn't have cats in the country and somebody came along and said, you know, every year I'm going to kill 55 million, somebody might throw their hands up in horror and say, that's just, you just can't do that. I think this may be the RSPB trying to keep its members happy by saying, well, you can have your cat and birds too. But nevertheless, cats are also good at keeping other avian predators down. They kill things which would feed on bird eggs and small birds. So you can see that cats may be doing a bit of a favour. It may well be in areas where you've got quite valuable wildlife, scarce habitats like heathland, that there needs to be a barrier, and some scientists have looked at the size of barrier there should be between your gardens and that area, about 300 or 400 metres, a sort of safety zone, because cats wander about 600 square metres each evening. So creating a buffer space is probably a good thing. Cats have their uses. This is from the RHS what's it called? Diaries, I guess, the RHS magazine from 1832. Dear sir, I beg leave to communicate to the Society an easy method of preserving fruit trees and gardens from the depredation of birds, as adopted by my friend Robert Brooke, Esquire of Melton Lodge, near Woodbridge in this county, which plan I saw in full operation a short time ago, which he assures me is that he has adopted for several years with the most complete success. He has 4 or 5 cats, each with a collar and light chain and swivel, about a yard long, with a large iron ring at the end. As soon as the gooseberries, currants and raspberries begin to ripen, a small stake is driven into the ground or bed near the trees to be protected, leaving about a yard and a half of the stake above ground. The ring is slipped over the head of the stake, and the cat, thus tethered in sight of the trees. No birds will approach them. Cherry trees and wall fruit trees are protected in the same manner as they successfully ripen. Each cat, by way of the shed, has one of the largest sized flower pots laid on its side, within reach of its chain, with little hay or straw in bad weather, and her food and water placed near. I think the manner of fastening the cat may be improved, so that one cat might protect a considerable distance of walk, by having 2 iron posts fixed in the ground, and with a cord or wire attached to them, pass through the ring of the cat's chain. The cat would thus be able to range the whole distance between the posts and might be moved from place to place as before described. These Victorians knew a thing about engineering, I have to say. And there you have it. Genius. Can't really mention wildlife gardening in London without mentioning the Wildlife Gardening Centre in Peckham, or very east of Dulwich, as the estate agents call it. Once upon a time it was a council dust yard for dustbin carts to come and park up, and it's been converted into a marvellous space and does enormous good work with schools and provides plants for sale and ideas for wildlife gardening, and is a great place to go. Not the easiest place to get to, but once you've got there, you'll see it's worth it. If it's raining too much, you can't bear to be outside for any longer. The garden museum, just on the north of the south bank of the river, is a great place to go, just across the river from Pimlico. A lovely, interesting and expanding garden museum. Of course, we are not alone. There are many parts of the world where wildlife gardening is taken seriously and maybe more systematically. This is a school in Germany where they've encouraging all their kids to involve themselves in wildlife gardening. In South Africa, the Indigenous Gardeners of Germany, where they are trying to encourage indigenous plants in a far more systematic way than we would do over here, trying to make sure that they bring back indigenous plants into their wildlife gardens. So, what worked? So, the artificial nest sites, the solitary bees, they tried three separate three methods. Straws, sort of drinking straws, put in a metal pot and putting it on their side. Holes drilled in wooden bits of wood and stacked up, and sort of bamboo poles stuck into plastic piping. The straws in the cans didn't attract a single solitary bee or insect. The bamboo shoots were quite effective, and the holes drilled into wood were more effective at attracting solitary bees and wasps. But 4 millimeter holes were better than the 6 millimeter holes. So the size of your hole makes a big difference. The artificial nest sites of bumblebees over 3 years, 3 different kinds of upturned can or buried can or terracotta pot, attracted a total of 0 bumblebees over the 3 years of the plan. Bumblebees have no shortage of spaces to find, so they don't really need extra places from us. The small ponds were fairly successful. They were all sustained over 3 years. They probably weren't big enough, and they probably needed some extra species from outside. They don't colonize themselves that easily. They need to be colonized artificially by us. The dead wood, after 3 years, had hardly rotted at all. If you're looking for short-term impacts and short-term effects, putting piles of dead wood out doesn't seem to make much difference. It won't attract many insects or many other invertebrates over a 3-year period. The patches of nettles attracted 2 butterfly larvae over 3 years. For some reason, the nettles didn't seem to make any impact, despite us thinking nettles do attract butterflies. In the 29 gardens they did the experiment on, had almost no impact whatsoever. So patches of nettles don't seem to be as effective as people might think. I'd like to sort of close by thanking Chloe, Smith, Louise and Mandy from Giggle, the Green Space Information for Greater London, Matthew Frith, London Wildlife Trust, the RHS Library, who were splendid in providing all sorts of interesting sources, and again, a great place to go, and my relatively incommunicative gardener, Matthew William, who did all the hard work to make my garden better. That's the RHS and India Library. It's a great place to go in central London. Marvellous place to find out more about the history of wildlife gardening and about a whole range of ideas from around the world. So, time, I think, for questions and discussion with a roving mic. Thank you very much.